Sarah Anderson froze mid-step on her cabin porch, the steaming coffee mug slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering against the snow-covered planks. There, sitting patiently beside her front door like some impossible Valentine's gift, was a massive black bear holding a bouquet of frozen wildflowers in his enormous jaws. This wasn't the starving, desperate creature she'd been secretly feeding for 6 weeks. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson's scream pierced the February morning silence from across the clearing, followed by the crash of her bird feeder hitting the ground as she stumbled backward into her kitchen door. The sound echoed off the Catskill Mountains like a gunshot, causing several crows to explode from the pine trees in a flurry of black wings and harsh cries. Sarah's mind raced to her grandfather Harold's faded photograph on the mantelpiece, the one of him sitting beside this same bear 15 years ago, both of them impossibly at peace together. "Call the ranger!" Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with terror from inside her house. How was Bruno still alive? And why had he come back now on the anniversary of Harold's death, carrying flowers like some gentle giant bringing comfort to the grieving? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, Sarah Anderson had arrived at her grandfather Harold's cabin with nothing but a suitcase, a broken heart, and $847.32 in her checking account. The January snow fell thick across the Catskill Mountains, blanketing the 1952 log structure that had been Harold's pride and joy until his death exactly 1 year ago. At 32, Sarah felt ancient, hollowed out by grief that had nothing to do with her grandfather and everything to do with the cancer that had stolen her husband Michael just 8 months prior. She'd been a veterinarian once, back when life made sense, back when she believed healing was possible. Now she couldn't bear to look at animals in pain, couldn't stomach the weight of life and death decisions that once felt like calling. The cabin was supposed to be temporary refuge, a place to figure out what came next when everything you'd planned your life around crumbled to ash. Harold Anderson had been a mystery even to his own family. A bachelor who'd inherited logging land from his father, he'd spent 40 years transforming it into something the locals whispered about but never quite understood. Sarah's mother had always said Harold talked to animals like people and people like they were interrupting something important. The cabin sat on 847 acres of dense woodland, far enough from the town of Hunter that your nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away through pine and birch trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. The place still smelled like Harold, pipe tobacco, wood polish, and something wilder that Sarah couldn't quite name. His photographs covered every surface: elk in meadows, hawks circling overhead, and dozens of bears in various seasons and poses. But it was the framed picture on the mantelpiece that stopped her cold every time she passed it. Harold, maybe 60 years old, sitting calmly beside an enormous black bear with a distinctive white patch on its chest. Both man and bear looked directly at the camera with an expression that seemed almost familiar. Sarah had found Harold's journals on her third day, hidden in a false bottom of his old roll-up desk. Page after page of meticulous handwriting documented feeding schedules, behavioral observations, and what could only be described as conversations with woodland creatures. The entries about a bear named Bruno spanned nearly 8 years, ending abruptly with Harold's final entry. "Bruno understands. Told him about Sarah. He'll wait." She'd dismissed it as the ramblings of an eccentric old man until the night she'd seen golden eyes watching her through the kitchen window. The bear had been massive, easily 400 pounds, with that same distinctive white chest patch from Harold's photograph. When their eyes met through the glass, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's diagnosis, a connection that transcended explanation. The next morning, she'd found paw prints circling the cabin like a protective border, and something inside her broken heart had stirred back to life. The blizzard hit on January 2nd with a fury that reminded Sarah why city folks feared mountain winters. Snow fell so thick she couldn't see the tree line 20 yards from her porch, and the wind howled through the pines like something wild and wounded. She'd stocked up on firewood and canned goods, but by the second day of being trapped inside, the isolation felt suffocating. That's when she saw him. Through the kitchen window, barely visible in the swirling snow, stood the massive black bear from Harold's photograph. He was thinner than in the picture, his ribs showing beneath his thick winter coat, and he moved with the careful deliberation of an animal conserving every ounce of energy. The bear, Bruno, according to Harold's journals, stood perfectly still in the clearing, snow accumulating on his broad shoulders as he stared directly at the cabin. Sarah's veterinary training kicked in before her common sense could stop her. This bear was starving. In the wild, black bears entered a state called torpor during winter months, sleeping deeply in dens and living off stored body fat. But something had gone wrong. Maybe his den had been disturbed, or perhaps the unseasonably warm December had disrupted his natural cycle. Whatever the cause, Bruno was awake, active, and dangerously thin. She pulled on her late husband's heavy winter coat and boots, grabbing the package of frozen salmon she'd been saving for a special occasion that would never come. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she stepped onto the porch. But Bruno didn't move. He watched her with those intelligent amber eyes, his massive head tilted slightly as if he was trying to understand her intentions. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered, the words forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Harold's not here anymore, but I am." She placed the salmon on the porch railing and backed slowly toward the door. Bruno waited until she was inside before approaching, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He took the fish gently, almost delicately for such a massive creature, and retreated to the edge of the clearing to eat. When he finished, he looked back at the cabin one more time before disappearing into the storm. Sarah's hands shook as she called her neighbor Mrs. Henderson, the closest thing to family she had in the area. "You did what?" Martha Henderson's voice crackled through the phone line. "Sarah, honey, you can't feed wild bears. It makes them dependent, dangerous. Next thing you know, he'll be breaking down your door looking for more." But Bruno didn't break down her door. He returned the next morning and sat quietly in the same spot, waiting. Sarah found herself watching for him, setting her morning coffee routine around his appearances. She told herself she was just monitoring the situation, being responsible. The truth was more complicated. Bruno's presence filled a silence in her life she hadn't realized was so profound. By the fourth day, the pattern was established. Bruno would appear at dawn, wait patiently while Sarah left food on the porch railing, and eat before retreating to the forest. He never approached the cabin directly, never showed aggression, never even made a sound. But his eyes followed Sarah's movements with an awareness that seemed almost human. The criticism from neighbors began immediately. Tom Bradley, who ran the local hardware store, called to warn her about encouraging dangerous wildlife behavior. Mrs. Henderson stopped by with pamphlets about bear safety and stories of attacks in other states. Even the mailman, usually chatty about local gossip, started avoiding eye contact when he delivered her sparse correspondence. "You're playing with fire," Mrs. Henderson said during one of her increasingly frequent visits. "Bears are wild animals, not pets. Your grandfather may have had some fool notion about befriending wildlife, but that doesn't mean it was right." Sarah knew they were correct, technically. Every wildlife management protocol she'd learned in veterinary school warned against feeding wild animals. But every morning when Bruno appeared, she saw something in his behavior that defied textbook explanations. He was careful, respectful of boundaries. and seemed to understand the unspoken rules of their interaction in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond typical animal behavior. The phone calls to local authorities started during the second week. David Collins, the regional wildlife officer, left a stern voicemail about illegal wildlife feeding and public safety concerns. Sarah listened to his message 3 times, hearing something in his tone that went beyond professional duty, a personal edge that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. But it was Harold's journal entry from 15 years ago that stopped her from calling Collins back immediately. Bruno understands loss the way humans do. His mother and siblings were killed by hunters when he was just a cub, found him starving, too young to survive alone. Some creatures are meant to bridge worlds, to teach us that love doesn't recognize species. When my time comes, I pray he'll find someone else who needs that lesson. Outside, snow began falling again, and Sarah watched Bruno take his usual position in the clearing, patient as a stone sculpture, waiting for a kindness that seemed to matter to him more than mere survival. The first gift appeared on January 15th, 3 days after the latest blizzard had finally cleared. Sarah opened her front door to find Bruno in his usual spot at the clearing's edge, but something was different. Beside him lay a carefully arranged bouquet of winter wildflowers, purple asters and white Queen Anne's lace that somehow hadn't been buried by the snow. The stems were frozen solid, but the blooms remained intact, as if they'd been preserved in nature's own display case. Sarah stared at the impossible sight. Wildflowers didn't bloom in January in the Catskills. These had to have been gathered from somewhere protected, maybe a south-facing slope where snow melted early, or perhaps from beneath a natural shelter. But the arrangement wasn't random. The flowers were laid out with deliberate care, the way someone might place a memorial bouquet. "Bruno?" she whispered from the doorway. The bear's ears perked at his name, and he made a soft chuffing sound that seemed almost like acknowledgement. When she stepped forward to examine the flowers more closely, he didn't retreat as usual. Instead, he watched her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, as if waiting for her reaction. The flowers were real, beautiful, and completely impossible. Sarah picked them up with trembling hands, noting how the stems had been carefully stripped of thorns and excess leaves. Someone, or something, had put genuine thought into this gift. But bears didn't gather flowers. Bears didn't arrange bouquets. Bears certainly didn't understand the human symbolism of offering flowers as a gesture of what? Gratitude? Friendship? The next morning brought another gift. A smooth, heart-shaped stone from the creek bed, still warm despite the freezing temperatures. Bruno had placed it precisely where the flowers had been, and again he waited, watching for her response. Sarah turned the stone over in her palm, marveling at its perfect symmetry. In 32 years, she'd never found a naturally heart-shaped rock, yet Bruno had somehow located this one and carried it to her door. By the third gift, a cluster of pine cones arranged in a perfect circle, Sarah knew she needed answers. She spent the afternoon combing through Harold's journals more carefully, looking for any explanation for Bruno's behavior. What she found in a leather-bound notebook tucked behind the others made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the book. Day 2847 with Bruno, Harold had written in his careful script. He brought Sarah's photograph to me today, the one from her veterinary school graduation that I keep on my desk. Carried it in his mouth without damaging it, placed it beside my chair, and looked at me with those eyes that see too much. I think he knows about the diagnosis. Animals sense these things before we do. I've been putting off telling the family about the cancer, but Bruno won't let me pretend anymore. Sarah's breath caught. She flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry documenting Bruno's gifts to Harold, Flowers on difficult days, interesting stones after Harold's chemotherapy sessions, pine cones arranged in patterns that seemed to correspond with Harold's moods. The bear hadn't just been Harold's companion, he'd been his caregiver, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. Day 2901, another entry read, told Bruno about Sarah today, showed him her pictures, explained that she's hurting too, that she lost someone she loved just like he lost his family. Bruno touched each photograph with his paw, so gentle it was like watching a person handle precious glass. I think he understands. God help me, I think he's been waiting for her. The final entry, dated just 3 days before Harold's death, nearly broke Sarah's heart. Bruno brought me daffodil bulbs today, the ones Sarah planted by the front steps when she was 12. Dug them up carefully, roots intact, and laid them by my feet. He knows it's time. Made him promise to watch over Sarah when I'm gone. He touched my hand with his paw, his way of saying yes. Some bonds don't break with death. Some love finds a way to continue. Sarah closed the journal and looked out the window to where Bruno sat patiently waiting for her to acknowledge his latest gift. The pieces were falling together in a way that defied every scientific principle she'd ever learned, yet felt more true than anything she'd experienced since Michael's death. Bruno wasn't just any bear. He was Harold's bear, Harold's companion, Harold's chosen family. And somehow, in the mysterious way that deep connections transcend species and even death, Harold had passed that guardianship to her. The sound of a truck engine grinding up the mountain road shattered her reverie. Through the window, she watched a green Forest Service vehicle navigate the icy driveway, its official insignia visible even from a distance. David Collins had finally come calling. Sarah's stomach dropped as she watched the ranger climb out of his truck, his hand resting casually on the radio clipped to his belt. Collins was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades outdoors. But it was his eyes that worried her most. Cold and hard as winter stone, with none of the warmth she'd expect from someone whose job was protecting wildlife. Bruno had noticed the vehicle, too. The bear rose to his full height, an impressive 7 feet of muscle and fur, and moved protectively closer to the cabin. His body language had changed completely. Gone was the gentle giant who brought flowers and heart-shaped stones. This was a wild animal recognizing a threat. Collins approached the porch with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his authority respected. When he knocked on Sarah's door, the sound echoed like gunshots through the quiet forest. Bruno's response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. "Ms. Anderson?" Collins called through the door, his voice carrying the weight of official business. "We need to talk about your bear problem." Sarah opened the door slowly, keeping her body positioned between Collins and the interior of the cabin. The ranger was even more imposing up close, his gray uniform crisp despite the mountain cold, his badge catching the weak January sunlight. Behind him, Bruno had moved to within 30 feet of the porch, closer than he'd ever come when strangers were present. "Ranger Collins," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why you're illegally feeding that bear," Collins replied, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "I've had multiple reports from neighbors about dangerous wildlife behavior in this area. Feeding wild animals is a federal offense, Ms. Anderson, punishable by fines up to $10,000 and possible jail time." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "I'm not sure I understand what you're—" "Don't play games with me." Collins stepped closer, and Sarah caught a whiff of tobacco and something else. Alcohol, maybe, though it was barely past noon. "That bear's been hanging around your property for weeks. Bears don't do that unless they're getting food, simple cause and effect." Behind Collins, Bruno had gone perfectly still, his massive head lowered and his ears pinned back. Sarah recognized the posture from her veterinary training, a warning stance that preceded either flight or attack. The bear was reading Colin's aggressive body language just as clearly as she was. "Even if I were feeding him," Sarah said carefully, "surely there are bigger wildlife management issues to worry about. Bruno's never shown any aggressive behavior toward—" "Bruno?" Collins's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You've named it. Jesus Christ, lady, do you have any idea how stupid that is? Wild animals aren't pets. They're predators. That thing could kill you without breaking a sweat." The ranger's voice had risen, and Sarah noticed his hand drifting toward the pistol holstered at his hip. Bruno noticed too. The bear's growl deepened, becoming something that Sarah felt in her bones rather than heard. "Please lower your voice," Sarah said, fighting to keep her own tone calm. "You're agitating him." "I'm agitating him?" Collins let out a harsh laugh. "Lady, that bear should be terrified of humans. The fact that it's comfortable enough to hang around here means you've already screwed up badly. When bears lose their natural fear of people, they become dangerous. End of story." As if to contradict Collins's words, Bruno took several steps back, giving ground despite his obvious discomfort with the ranger's presence. The bear's body language spoke of wariness, not aggression, the behavior of an animal trying to de-escalate rather than fight. Collins either didn't notice or didn't care about Bruno's retreat. "I'm giving you 48 hours to stop feeding that animal. If it's still hanging around after that, I'll be back with a team to relocate it. And if relocation isn't possible—" He let the threat hang in the air. "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "It means problem bears get put down, Ms. Anderson. Permanently." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, her mind racing through everything she'd learned about Bruno from Harold's journals. This wasn't just any bear. This was a creature who'd spent 8 years as Harold's companion, who brought gifts and seemed to understand human emotion in ways that defied explanation. The thought of Collins shooting him was unbearable. "There has to be another way," Sarah said. "Bruno's not dangerous. He's never threatened anyone, never shown aggression. Surely your department has protocols for situations like this?" "Situations like what?" "A woman too stupid to follow basic wildlife safety?" Collins's voice dripped with contempt. "Let me educate you about bear behavior, Dr. Anderson. Yes, I know about your veterinary background, which makes this even more inexcusable. Bears are apex predators. They view humans as either threats or food sources. Your grandfather might have filled your head with Disney nonsense about talking to animals, but reality doesn't work that way." The mention of Harold made Sarah's blood run cold. "How do you know about my grandfather?" Collins smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Harold Anderson was a thorn in my side for years, always interfering with legitimate wildlife management, claiming his bears were special. I've been waiting a long time to clean up the mess he left behind." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Collins hadn't just happened to hear about Sarah's situation. He'd been watching, waiting for an excuse to finish something he'd started with Harold. This wasn't about public safety. It was personal. "Get off my property," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. 48 hours, Collins repeated, seemingly unbothered by her demand. "After that, your pet bear becomes my problem to solve. Permanently." As Collins turned to leave, Bruno moved again, this time positioning himself directly between the ranger and Sarah. The message was unmistakable. The bear was protecting her, just as Harold's journal had suggested he would. Collins noticed the movement and his hand dropped to his weapon. "You see that?" he said, pointing at Bruno. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. A healthy wild bear would have run at the first sight of a human. This one's challenging me, marking territory. That's dangerous behavior that gets people killed." But Sarah saw something different in Bruno's posture. Yes, the bear was standing his ground, but his head was slightly bowed, his movements deliberate rather than threatening. This wasn't a challenge. It was a statement. Bruno was claiming Sarah as family, just as he'd claimed Harold years before. After Collins drove away, Sarah sat on her porch steps, her entire body shaking from adrenaline and fear. Bruno approached slowly, settling beside the steps at a respectful distance. For several minutes, they simply sat together in the winter silence, both processing what had just happened. "He wants to kill you," Sarah whispered, and Bruno's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. "I can't let that happen, but I don't know how to stop him." That evening, Sarah drove into town for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Hunter was the kind of small mountain community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news of her confrontation with Collins had already spread. The hardware store fell silent when she walked in, and she could feel eyes following her movements as she gathered supplies. Tom Bradley, the store owner, rang up her purchases with obvious reluctance. "Heard you had a visit from Fish and Wildlife today," he said without looking at her. "Word travels fast," Sarah replied. "Collins is good people," Tom said, his tone carrying a warning. "Known him for 15 years. He's just trying to keep folks safe." But Martha Henderson, Harold's elderly neighbor who'd been picking up prescriptions at the pharmacy counter, had a different perspective. "David Collins has been gunning for your grandfather's bears since the day he got that badge," she said, loudly enough for the whole store to hear. Harold saved more wildlife than Collins ever protected. The store erupted in whispered arguments as Sarah made her escape. Driving back up the mountain, she realized the community was divided about more than just her situation with Bruno. There were old wounds here, old conflicts between different approaches to wildlife management. Back at the cabin, Sarah found Bruno waiting with another gift, a small, perfect bird's nest that must have taken hours to locate in the winter landscape. As she examined the intricate weaving of twigs and moss, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She wasn't going to let Collins win. Harold had trusted her with something precious, and she'd be damned if she'd let fear and bureaucracy destroy it. But she needed help, and she knew exactly who to call. The next morning, Sarah dialed the number she'd found in Harold's address book. Martha Anderson, her grandmother, Harold's sister, and according to the journals, the only family member who'd truly understood Harold's work with wildlife. "Sarah, honey," Martha's voice was warm and strong despite her 78 years. "I've been wondering when you'd finally call your old grandmother." "Grandma Martha, I need help," Sarah said, and found herself pouring out the entire story. Bruno, the gifts, Collins' threats, everything. There was a long pause before Martha spoke again. "That bear's still alive? After all these years?" Her voice carried wonder and something else, relief. "Sarah, honey, I'm driving up there right now. We need to talk face to face, and there are things about your grandfather you need to know. Things that might save Bruno's life." "What kind of things?" "The kind that David Collins has been trying to bury for 15 years, Martha said grimly. "Pack a bag, dear. We might need to take a trip." As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked out to see Bruno in his usual spot, patient as always. But today, something was different. The bear's attention wasn't focused on the cabin. Instead, he was looking toward the tree line, his body tense with alertness. Following his gaze, Sarah caught a glint of metal among the pines. Someone was watching them with binoculars, and she had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who it was. Martha Anderson arrived like a force of nature, her ancient Buick grinding up the mountain road with the determination of a woman who'd been driving these hills for 6 decades. At 78, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone half her age, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her keen blue eyes missing nothing as she surveyed the cabin and surrounding forest. "Where is he? were her first words as she climbed out of the car, not bothering with hellos or explanations. Sarah pointed toward the tree line where Bruno sat in his usual spot, and Martha's face transformed. The stern expression melted into something between wonder and profound sadness as she took in the sight of the massive bear. "My God," Martha whispered, "he's gotten so big, but those eyes, those are still Harold's Bruno." "You knew about Bruno?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to realize there was much about her family she'd never understood. "Knew about him?" "Honey, I helped Harold raise that bear from a cub." Martha's voice carried 15 years of carefully guarded secrets. "Bruno's mother was shot by poachers when he was barely 3 months old. Harold found him dying of starvation, too young to survive on his own. By the time I convinced Harold to call Fish and Wildlife, Bruno had already imprinted on him. The official recommendation was euthanasia." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What happened?" "Harold happened." Martha smiled grimly. "Your grandfather could be stubborn as a mule when he set his mind to something. He kept Bruno hidden, raised him in secret, and spent 8 years proving that human-bear bonds could work when approached with respect and understanding. But David Collins never accepted it. The pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Collins knew Harold was keeping Bruno. Collins was a junior ranger then, ambitious and by the book. He filed report after report trying to get Bruno confiscated and destroyed. When that didn't work, he started making Harold's life hell. Surprise inspections, citations for minor violations, anything to force compliance. Martha's voice hardened. "The stress contributed to Harold's cancer, I'm convinced of it. The man spent his final years fighting bureaucrats instead of enjoying his friendship with Bruno." Sarah looked toward the forest where Bruno waited patiently, and her heart ached thinking of Harold's struggles. But Harold died a year ago. How has Bruno survived on his own? Bears are incredibly intelligent, and Bruno had 8 years of learning from Harold. But more importantly, Harold prepared him. Martha pulled a thick envelope from her purse. "These are Harold's final instructions, Sarah. He knew Collins would come after Bruno eventually, and he wanted to protect him." The envelope contained legal documents that made Sarah's head spin. Harold Anderson Wildlife Trust, established 3 years before his death with Martha as executor, $50 million in carefully invested assets, designated for wildlife conservation and protection. But the conditions were specific and bizarre. The trust could only be activated by a direct Anderson family member who was actively engaged in the protection of native wildlife species through personal guardianship. "Harold left you this responsibility," Martha explained. "He believed Bruno would eventually lead you to your calling, just as Bruno led Harold to his. But the trust comes with conditions. You have to prove you're genuinely committed to wildlife protection, not just playing with a pet bear." $50 million? Sarah's voice cracked. "Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" "Because Harold was specific about the timing. The trust only activates when an Anderson family member makes the choice to protect wildlife despite personal risk." Martha fixed Sarah with a stern look. "Collins threatening Bruno, that's the test, honey. Harold knew this day would come." The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the trees, Sarah could see multiple trucks making their way up the mountain road, not just Collins's Forest Service vehicle, but what looked like a full response team. "They're early," Martha said grimly, checking her watch. "Collins said 48 hours, but it's only been 36. Bruno had noticed the approaching vehicles, too. The bear rose to his full height, every muscle tense as he assessed the threat. But instead of retreating to the forest as Sarah expected, Bruno moved closer to the cabin, positioning himself between the driveway and the 2 women. "He's protecting us," Sarah realized aloud. "Just like Harold trained him to," Martha confirmed. But Sarah, you need to understand, if Collins sees Bruno's protective behavior, he'll classify him as an immediate threat. They'll shoot first and justify it later. The convoy stopped at the base of the driveway, too far away to see clearly but close enough to make intentions clear. Sarah counted at least 4 vehicles and what looked like 8 or 9 people. This wasn't a simple wildlife relocation. This was a paramilitary operation. Collins's voice boomed through a megaphone, echoing off the surrounding mountains. "Sarah Anderson, we're here to resolve the dangerous wildlife situation on your property. Come out with your hands visible." Dangerous wildlife situation? Sarah's anger flared. "Bruno's done nothing but sit quietly in the forest." Martha grabbed Sarah's arm. "Listen to me carefully. Harold prepared for this moment, but you have to choose. There's a way to save Bruno, but it means accepting responsibility for his protection permanently. It means becoming his legal guardian through the Wildlife Trust, which makes you accountable for his behavior for the rest of his life." What does that mean practically? It means if Bruno ever hurts someone, you're criminally liable. It means building proper facilities, hiring veterinary staff, submitting to regular inspections. It means your life becomes about protecting not just Bruno, but creating a model for human-wildlife coexistence that other states might adopt. Martha's voice was urgent as Collins's team began moving up the driveway. "Harold believed you were strong enough for this responsibility, but the choice has to be yours." Sarah looked at Bruno, still standing guard despite the approaching threat. The bear could have fled into the deep forest where Collins's team would never find him. Instead, he'd chosen to stay, to protect the human who'd shown him kindness. The parallel to Harold's own choices wasn't lost on her. "How do we activate the trust?" Martha smiled for the first time since arriving. "With this." She pulled out a satellite phone from her purse. "Harold set up an emergency line directly to the State Attorney General's office. One call activates the trust and places Bruno under legal protection as an endangered species research subject." "But Bruno's not endangered." "No, but the human-bear relationship Harold documented is, there are only 3 recorded cases in North America of successful long-term human-bear partnerships. Bruno represents irreplaceable research data about animal cognition and interspecies communication." Collins's voice crackled through the megaphone again, closer now. "Final warning, exit the property or face charges of obstruction." Sarah looked at the phone in Martha's hand, then at Bruno still standing protectively in the clearing. Everything Harold had worked for, everything he'd sacrificed, came down to this moment. But more than that, Sarah realized this was about honoring the trust a grieving bear had placed in her grandfather, and that she was now being asked to carry forward. "Make the call," Sarah said. Martha's fingers flew over the satellite phone's keypad. Within moments, she was speaking rapidly to someone in the Attorney General's office, reading serial numbers from Harold's legal documents and providing case references that had clearly been prepared years in advance. "Confirmed," Martha said, ending the call. "The Harold Anderson Wildlife Trust is now active. Bruno is officially protected under state research provisions. Collins's team has no authority to harm him." But when Sarah looked down the driveway, her relief turned to horror. Collins had separated from his team and was approaching on foot, a high-powered rifle slung across his shoulder. His body language spoke of a man who'd moved beyond official protocols into something personal and dangerous. Bruno saw Collins coming too, and the bear's protective stance shifted subtly. This wasn't the careful positioning Sarah had seen before. This was a wild animal preparing to defend his territory and his family against a perceived threat. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered. "Collins should have gotten word about the trust protection by now. Why is he still approaching?" Martha's face had gone pale as she watched Collins advance. "Because this was never really about following regulations," she said grimly. "This is about David Collins finishing what he started 15 years ago. And I don't think he cares anymore whether it's legal or not. Collins moved up the driveway with the deliberate pace of a man who'd made peace with violence. His rifle was no longer slung casually across his shoulder. He carried it at the ready, finger near the trigger guard, eyes locked on Bruno with the intensity of a predator stalking prey. Behind him, his team had spread out in a loose formation, creating what looked disturbingly like a military assault pattern rather than a wildlife management operation. "David Collins!" Martha shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Stand down immediately! That bear is now under state protection!" Collins paused, turning his cold gaze toward the two women on the porch. "Protection expired the moment it became a threat to public safety," he called back. "That animal just demonstrated aggressive territorial behavior. I'm authorized to use lethal force." Sarah's blood ran cold. Bruno hadn't shown aggression. He'd shown protection, positioning himself between perceived danger and his family. But she realized with growing horror that Collins was deliberately misinterpreting the bear's behavior to justify what he'd planned to do all along. "He's not being aggressive," Sarah shouted. "He's just standing there." "A wild bear that doesn't retreat from humans is by definition dangerous," Collins replied, raising his rifle. "This ends now." Bruno seemed to sense the shift in tension. The massive bear rose to his full height, an impressive sight that would have sent any normal person backing away in healthy fear. But Collins' expression didn't change. If anything, the ranger seemed pleased that Bruno was making himself a larger target. Martha grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "Get inside the cabin, now!" "I'm not leaving Bruno. Harold left specific instructions for this scenario," Martha hissed urgently. "Trust me, Sarah." "Get to the cabin's basement. There's something down there you need to see." The sound of Collins chambering around echoed across the clearing like a death sentence. Bruno heard it too, his massive head swiveled toward the ranger, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, the bear let out a sound that was purely wild, a rumbling warning that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Threatening behavior," Collins shouted to his team, "documenting vocal aggression." Sarah realized she was watching a setup, a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to justify killing Bruno regardless of his actual behavior. Collins had no intention of honoring the state protection order. He was creating his own narrative, one that would paint him as a hero who'd saved the community from a dangerous predator. "The basement, Sarah," Martha's voice cracked with desperation. "Harold's final gift. It's the only way to save Bruno now." Sarah ran for the cabin door, her heart hammering as she heard Collins barking orders to his team. The basement stairs creaked under her feet as she descended into the musty darkness below. She'd been down here only once before, briefly, and had dismissed it as typical basement storage. Old furniture, boxes of Harold's belongings, the usual detritus of a long life. But Martha had followed her down, and she was heading directly to what looked like a blank wall at the far end of the basement. "Help me move this shelf," Martha commanded, grabbing one end of a heavy bookcase that Sarah had assumed was built in. Behind the bookcase was a hidden room Sarah never could have imagined. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, and what looked like 15 years of meticulous record-keeping. But it wasn't just about Bruno. There were files on dozens of wildlife situations, documentation of Collins' behavior patterns, and most shocking of all, video equipment that had apparently been recording the clearing around the cabin for years. "Harold knew this day would come," Martha explained, her fingers flying over computer keyboards that looked far more sophisticated than anything an elderly mountain man should have owned. He documented everything, every interaction with Bruno, every conflict with Collins, every piece of evidence that proves Collins has been conducting a personal vendetta rather than following wildlife management protocols. On the monitors, Sarah could see multiple angles of the scene unfolding outside. Collins had moved to within 50 yards of Bruno, his rifle aimed directly at the bear's chest. But Bruno wasn't advancing or showing aggression. He was actually backing away, trying to de-escalate exactly as Harold's journals had described. "This footage proves Bruno isn't dangerous," Sarah breathed. "More than that," Martha said grimly, pulling up files on another screen. "Harold discovered that Collins has been falsifying wildlife incident reports for years. Look at this." The documents Martha displayed made Sarah's stomach turn. Report after report of aggressive wildlife encounters that resulted in animal deaths, but when cross-referenced with Harold's independent documentation, told completely different stories. Bears shot while retreating. Wolves killed for pack-hunting behavior that was actually normal foraging. A systematic pattern of eliminating wildlife under false pretenses. "Collins has been using his position to wage a personal war against predators," Martha explained. "Harold gathered evidence for 3 years before his death, trying to build a case that would hold up in court, but he ran out of time." Outside, Collins's voice carried clearly through the cabin's walls. "Animal showing signs of rabies-like aggression. Immediate lethal response authorized." "He's lying," Sarah shouted, watching Bruno on the monitors. The bear was actually lying down now, making himself smaller and less threatening, behavior that any wildlife expert would recognize as submission, not aggression. Martha's hands were shaking as she worked the computer controls. "Harold installed a direct feed to the State Wildlife Commission. If I can activate it, they'll see exactly what's happening here. But the system needs a few minutes to establish connection." The crack of Collins' rifle split the mountain air like thunder. Sarah screamed and ran for the stairs, Martha close behind her. They burst onto the porch to see Bruno stumbling, a bright splash of red staining his dark fur just behind his left shoulder. The bear had been shot, but he was still standing, still positioning himself between Collins and the cabin. "Wounded animal," Collins shouted to his team. "Even more dangerous now. Prepare for follow-up shots." But something had changed in the clearing. Bruno's pained roar had carried far beyond the immediate area, and answering calls were echoing back from the surrounding forest. Sarah realized with amazement that other bears were responding. Bruno's distress call had summoned help in a way that defied everything she thought she knew about bear behavior. Collins heard the other bears too, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. His team was looking nervously toward the tree line, where dark shapes were becoming visible among the pines. What had been planned as a simple execution was turning into something much more complex and dangerous. "Stand down," Martha shouted, holding up her phone. "This entire incident is being broadcast live to the State Wildlife Commission. Every action you take is being recorded and transmitted." Collins' face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. The live feed meant independent witnesses to his actions, witnesses who could see that Bruno was wounded and submissive, not aggressive. Witnesses who could see that Collins was preparing to execute a helpless animal while other bears gathered in what looked disturbingly like a funeral gathering. "Technical difficulties," Collins snarled into his radio. "Communication equipment malfunctioning. Proceeding with lethal force authorization." He raised his rifle again, aiming for Bruno's head this time. The wounded bear looked directly at Sarah, those amber eyes holding an intelligence and acceptance that broke her heart. Bruno understood what was happening, understood that Collins intended to kill him, but he still refused to abandon his protective position. Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She stepped off the porch and walked directly toward Bruno, placing herself between the wounded bear and Collins's rifle. "If you want to shoot him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, "you'll have to shoot me first." Behind her, she could hear Martha frantically working her phone, and she prayed the connection to the State Wildlife Commission was strong enough to document whatever happened next. But more importantly, she felt Bruno's massive presence at her back, felt the trust Harold had written about in his journals, the kind of bond that transcended species and touched something fundamental about what it meant to love without conditions. Collins' rifle was trained on both of them now, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he'd moved far beyond following regulations. This had become something personal and primitive, a confrontation that would end only when someone backed down or someone died. The standoff stretched across seconds that felt like hours. Colin's rifle trained on Sarah and Bruno while Martha's frantic voice carried from the porch as she coordinated with state authorities. But it was the sound of approaching vehicles that broke the deadly tableau. Not more of Colin's reinforcements, but civilian cars racing up the mountain road with the desperation of people who'd received urgent news. Tom Bradley's hardware store truck led the convoy, followed by Mrs. Henderson's ancient sedan and half a dozen other vehicles Sarah recognized from town. The entire community of hunters seemed to be converging on Harold's cabin, drawn by word that had spread faster than Collins could contain it. "What the hell?" Collins started, his rifle wavering as he tried to process this unexpected development. Tom Bradley climbed out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man who'd made a difficult decision. In his hands was a thick folder that he held up like a shield. "David Collins," he called out in a voice that carried across the clearing, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what really happened to your boy." Collins' face went white beneath his weathered tan. "You don't know what you're talking about, Bradley." "Don't I?" Tom stepped closer, his voice gaining strength as other community members emerged from their vehicles. "See, after Martha called around this morning, folks started remembering things, started talking about that day 5 years ago when little Danny Collins fell from your treehouse. Funny how the story changed over time." Sarah felt Bruno shift behind her, the wounded bear's breathing labored but steady. Blood was still seeping from his shoulder wound, but he remained upright, still protecting her even as his own life drained away. She pressed her hand gently against his massive flank, offering what comfort she could while the drama unfolded around them. Mrs. Henderson had climbed out of her car as well, moving with the determined stride of a woman who'd kept secrets too long. "I was there that day, David," she called out, her elderly voice surprisingly strong. "I saw you drinking on the porch while Danny played alone in that treehouse you built too high and too unstable. Saw you passed out when that boy fell and broke his back." "Shut up," Collins snarled, swinging his rifle toward Mrs. Henderson. "You don't know anything." "I know you blamed the bears because you couldn't live with the truth," Mrs. Henderson continued, unfazed by the weapon pointed at her. "I know you've been killing innocent animals for 5 years to make yourself feel better about your own negligence. And I know Harold Anderson died trying to stop you." The folder in Tom Bradley's hands contained what he began reading aloud: police reports from Danny Collins' accident, medical records, witness statements that painted a very different picture from the bear attack story Collins had been telling for years. Danny Collins had indeed been paralyzed, but by a fall from a poorly constructed treehouse while his father was too drunk to supervise him properly. "The bears had nothing to do with your son's accident," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger as more community members gathered behind him. "But you needed someone to blame, didn't you? Easier than admitting you built a death trap and then got too drunk to watch your own kid." Collins's rifle was shaking now, his face cycling through rage, shame, and desperate denial. "You're all lying," he whispered, but the words carried no conviction. "The bear attacked him." "I saw the tracks." "You saw what you needed to see," Martha said from the porch, her phone still in her hand. "Just like you've been seeing threats in every wildlife encounter since then. Harold documented it all, David. Every falsified report, every animal you killed, based on lies. The State Wildlife Commission has been reviewing your cases for the past hour." Sarah could hear sirens in the distance now, real authorities coming to sort out the mess Collins had created. But she was more concerned about Bruno, whose breathing had become increasingly shallow. The bear needed medical attention immediately, and she was the only veterinarian within 50 miles. "Let me help him," Sarah said, not moving from her position but speaking directly to Collins. "Whatever this is about, Bruno doesn't deserve to die for your mistakes. For a moment, something human flickered in Colin's eyes, a recognition of the pain he'd caused, the innocent lives he'd taken in his quest to avoid responsibility for his son's accident. But then the moment passed and his face hardened again. "That animal is dangerous," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It has to be destroyed." "Look at him," Sarah said softly. "Really look at him, David. He's wounded, submissive, trying to protect someone he loves. Does that sound like a dangerous predator to you?" Behind her, Bruno made a soft sound. Not a growl or roar, but something almost like a whimper. The massive bear was in pain and growing weaker, but he still refused to abandon his protective position. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the depth of loyalty Harold had inspired in this magnificent creature. The approaching sirens grew louder, and Colin seemed to realize his window of opportunity was closing. His rifle came up again, finger tightening on the trigger, but this time he wasn't aiming at Bruno. He was aiming at Sarah, the woman who'd disrupted his carefully constructed narrative and threatened to expose years of lies. "You should have minded your own business," Colin said, his voice hollow with desperate rage. But before he could fire, Bruno moved. Despite his wound, despite his weakened condition, the massive bear surged forward with lightning speed, placing himself directly between Colin's rifle and Sarah. The shot that followed echoed across the mountains like thunder, but it struck only air. Collins had jerked the rifle upward at the last second, unable to shoot through the wall of fur and muscle that was Bruno's protective form. The moment of hesitation cost Collins everything. State police vehicles were pouring into the clearing now, their occupants emerging with weapons drawn and orders to secure the scene. Collins found himself surrounded, outnumbered, and facing the consequences of years of lies and violence. "David Collins," the lead state trooper announced, "you're under arrest for falsifying official reports, animal cruelty, and endangering civilians. Drop your weapon immediately." Collins' rifle clattered to the ground as the fight went out of him. He stood motionless as handcuffs clicked around his wrists, his face a mask of defeat and exhaustion. The vendetta that had consumed 5 years of his life was finally over. But Sarah's attention was entirely focused on Bruno, who had collapsed after his final protective surge. The bear lay on his side, breathing heavily, his amber eyes still alert but clouded with pain. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder where Colin's bullet had torn through muscle and tissue. "I need my medical kit," Sarah said to no one in particular, her veterinary training taking over. "And someone needs to call the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Bruno needs surgery if he's going to survive." Martha was already on her phone, coordinating with emergency veterinary services. Tom Bradley and several other community members had approached cautiously, forming a protective circle around Sarah and Bruno as she began emergency first aid on the wounded bear. "Is he going to be okay?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Sarah pressed gauze against Bruno's wound, feeling the massive heart beating steadily beneath her hands. "He's lost blood, but the bullet missed major organs. With proper treatment, yes. I think he's going to be fine." As if he understood her words, Bruno lifted his massive head slightly and looked directly at Sarah. In those amber eyes, she saw something that took her breath away. Not just trust or gratitude, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of the bond Harold had written about in his journals. The kind of connection that transcended species and touched something fundamental about love and loyalty. The veterinary emergency team arrived within an hour, bringing equipment and expertise that Sarah lacked. As they prepared Bruno for transport to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Sarah found herself thinking about Harold's final journal entry. Bruno had indeed watched over her, just as he'd promised Harold he would. But more than that, the bear had led her to something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a purpose, a calling, and a family that defied every conventional definition of the word. Martha approached as the emergency team worked, her elderly face bright with something between relief and vindication. Harold would be proud, she said simply. You chose to protect Bruno, even when it meant risking everything. That's exactly what he hoped you'd do. What happens now? Sarah asked, watching the veterinary team stabilize Bruno for transport. Now you become what Harold always believed you could be, Martha replied. The legal guardian of the Harold Anderson Wildlife Trust, protector of Bruno and any other animals who need sanctuary. It's a big responsibility, Sarah. Are you ready for it? Sarah looked at Bruno, sedated now but still aware, his eyes tracking her movements with that impossible intelligence. She thought about her empty life before coming to the cabin, the grief and purposelessness that had consumed her since Michael's death. Then she thought about the past 6 weeks, the daily ritual of caring for Bruno, the connection she'd felt with something wild and beautiful, the way protecting him had awakened something in her that she'd thought was dead forever. Yes, she said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. I'm ready. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the wraparound porch of Harold's cabin, her cabin now, watching Bruno lumber through the morning sunshine toward his favorite spot beneath the old oak tree. The bear moved with only the slightest limp, a reminder of his encounter with Collins, but no longer a source of pain. His shoulder had healed remarkably well, aided by Sarah's veterinary expertise and what seemed like an almost supernatural will to recover. The Harold Anderson Wildlife Sanctuary had transformed the property in ways Sarah could never have imagined. Professional enclosures now dotted the forest, designed to provide security while maintaining as natural an environment as possible. Bruno had the run of 47 acres, with additional space available when needed, but more often than not, he chose to spend his time near the cabin, maintaining the routines he'd established during those first precious weeks with Sarah. Martha had moved into the guest room permanently, claiming she was too old to manage her own house, but fooling no one. At 78, she was the sanctuary's unofficial administrative director, managing paperwork, coordinating with state officials, and charming donors with stories about Harold's vision coming to life. This morning, she emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just completed a particularly challenging phone call. The University of Vermont wants to send a research team, Martha announced, settling into the rocking chair beside Sarah's. They're studying human-animal bonding, and apparently Bruno's relationship with you and Harold is unprecedented in the scientific literature. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that had become part of her morning ritual. What kind of research? Non-invasive observation, behavioral documentation, that sort of thing. The lead researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, specializes in animal cognition. She thinks Bruno might help prove theories about emotional intelligence in bears that most scientists consider too anthropomorphic to study seriously. Through the trees, Sarah could see construction crews working on the new visitor center, a beautiful timber frame building that would allow the public to learn about wildlife conservation while maintaining respectful distance from the animals themselves. The sanctuary had received over $2 million in donations since the story of Bruno and Collins had made national news, turning Harold's dream into a reality that exceeded even his ambitious plans. Bruno's daily gifts had continued, though they'd evolved with the seasons. Spring had brought carefully selected wildflowers. Summer offered perfect stones and interesting pieces of driftwood from the creek. And now autumn was producing an array of colorful leaves arranged with artistic precision. Each morning, Sarah would find Bruno's offering placed carefully beside the porch steps, and each morning she would examine it with the same wonder she'd felt during those first impossible weeks. Dr. Chen thinks the gift-giving behavior indicates symbolic thinking, Martha continued. She wants to document whether Bruno's choices show intentionality, whether he's trying to communicate specific emotions or concepts through his selections. The sound of a vehicle on the mountain road interrupted their conversation. Tom Bradley's truck appeared through the trees, followed by Mrs. Henderson's sedan and several other familiar vehicles. Sunday morning had become community coffee time at the sanctuary, an informal gathering that brought together people who'd been divided by the Collins incident but found common ground in supporting Sarah's work. Tom climbed out of his truck carrying a thermos and a grin. "Morning, ladies." "Bruno looks good today." The bear in question had noticed the arrivals and was making his way toward the gathering, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal who'd learned to trust the humans in his territory. Children from the community had become regular visitors, and Bruno seemed to understand that his behavior around them required special gentleness. He would lie down when they were present, making himself less imposing, and accept their awed stares with patient dignity. "Any word on Collins?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she joined the group on the porch. Martha's expression sobered. "He pled guilty to all charges. 5 years in state prison, plus restitution to the families of animals he killed unlawfully. His pension is being used to fund wildlife protection programs." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Collins had caused immense damage, both to wildlife and to her own family's legacy. But she'd also seen the broken man beneath the rage, someone destroyed by grief and guilt who'd channeled his pain into violence rather than healing. Prison seemed appropriate, but she hoped he'd find a way to make peace with himself during those years. "What about Danny?" Sarah asked. Collins's son had been largely absent from the public narrative, but she'd often wondered how he'd processed his father's lies about his accident. "He's doing well, actually," Tom replied. "Started college this fall, studying environmental science. Says he wants to work in wildlife conservation, maybe as a way of making amends for what his father did." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Collins's vendetta against wildlife had ultimately inspired his own son to dedicate his life to protecting the very creatures his father had tried to destroy. Sarah thought Harold would have appreciated the poetic justice in that outcome. Bruno had reached the porch area and settled onto his haunches at the edge of the gathering, close enough to be part of the group but far enough away to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. His amber eyes tracked the conversation with that uncanny intelligence that never failed to amaze visitors. Dr. Chen was right. There was something happening behind those eyes that transcended typical animal awareness. "Speaking of making amends," Martha said, pulling an envelope from her sweater pocket. "This arrived yesterday." The return address made Sarah's breath catch. It was from Michael's sister Rebecca, who'd cut off all contact after his funeral. Sarah had been too consumed by grief to fight for the relationship, but Rebecca's absence had added another layer of loss to an already devastating time. Inside the envelope was a newspaper clipping about the sanctuary and a brief note. "Michael would be so proud of what you're building. He always said you had the biggest heart of anyone he knew. When you're ready, I'd love to visit and meet Bruno. Love, Rebecca." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she read the words aloud. The sanctuary had given her purpose and family, but she hadn't realized until this moment how much she'd missed having a connection to Michael's memory that wasn't solely defined by loss and grief. "Family has a way of finding its way back," Martha observed gently. "Harold used to say that love doesn't die. It just changes form and finds new ways to express itself." As if summoned by the mention of love and family, Bruno rose and walked directly to Sarah. Without any prompting, the massive bear placed his enormous paw gently on her knee, looking up at her with those expressive eyes. The gesture was so tender, so perfectly timed, that the entire gathering fell silent. "He knows," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "He actually knows you're emotional about something." Sarah placed her hand on Bruno's massive head, feeling the warmth and solidity of this creature who'd become so much more than Harold's legacy or a conservation success story. Bruno had become family in the truest sense, not bound by species or blood, but by choice, loyalty, and a love that transcended every boundary humans typically recognized. The morning sun climbed higher over the Catskill Mountains, warming the porch where an unlikely family had gathered. Martha with her stories and fierce protectiveness, Tom and Mrs. Henderson representing a community that had learned to embrace what they didn't fully understand, and Sarah finding purpose in carrying forward a love that had begun with her grandfather and would continue long after she was gone. Bruno's gift that morning had been different from his usual offerings, a single, perfect acorn that he'd placed beside the porch steps. Martha had explained that acorns symbolized potential in many cultures, the idea that small beginnings could grow into mighty oaks given proper care and time. Looking around at the sanctuary taking shape, at the families who'd found healing through their connection to wildlife, at the research that would help other communities learn to coexist with their wild neighbors, Sarah understood that Harold's acorn of an idea had indeed grown into something mighty. And at the heart of it all was Bruno, the bear who'd carried love across species lines and taught an entire community that the boundaries between wild and tame, between family and stranger, were far more fluid than anyone had dared imagine. The gift hadn't been the flowers or stones or carefully arranged leaves. The real gift had been Bruno himself, living proof that love, once given freely, has the power to transform everything it touches. Sometimes, life asks us to start over when we thought our story was finished. Sarah found herself alone at 68, widowed and wondering if her best years were behind her. But in the mountains of New York, she discovered something remarkable. Love doesn't end when we lose someone dear. It transforms and finds new ways to touch our hearts. Through her bond with Bruno, a gentle giant who taught an entire community about trust and healing, Sarah learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about choosing to care for someone, even when that someone is different from us. Her grandfather Harold's legacy lived on through every life saved at the sanctuary, proving that the love we give during our lifetime creates ripples that extend far beyond our years. Martha, at 78, found purpose in protecting what Harold built, showing that our wisdom and experience become gifts to future generations. The sanctuary became a place where broken hearts heal, where community divides mend, and where the simple act of showing up for someone in need creates miracles. Your story isn't over. It's waiting for its next beautiful chapter. Share with us. Have you ever found unexpected family or purpose after a major life change? What's the most meaningful connection you've made with someone or something that others might not understand?